So, I wanted to have a discussion or a conversation about what it's been like to change from a traditional classroom environment to now working in a virtual classroom. I want to share some of my experiences about the things that have been useful, and I also would like to have maybe an ongoing conversation either in the discussion comments or perhaps we could share some different links from teachers about this experience. It's been really strange. So I wanted to give you a bit of background about my school. I'm teaching as a secondary teacher here in Norway, and we've just now been in quarantine. Schools have been closed for the last week, and all of our teaching is now happening online. Um, my students are already familiar, or were already familiar with Google Suites, so we've been using Google Classroom to post assignments, shared documents, Google Docs, and Google Drive as a way to kind of keep all of our resources together. So we have that as an advantage already, that we've already been working with these kinds of tools. And now what we decided to do was keep our normal high school lesson working in the same time, the same way, and we just meet virtually with some support with additional resources posted to Google Classroom. So I want to talk a little bit more about that virtual classroom, meaning the time that we're actually spending together on the Google Meet platform. If you haven't used Google Meet, it's very similar to any other video conferencing call where there's voices. There's a list of all the participants on the side, and when someone speaks, their image pops up. And there's also a chat. But what I think I really want to focus on is much less about the technology, which you can already probably identify that I'm no expert about, and more about the shifts in pedagogy, in the things that we've had to do or I've had to do a little bit differently that have been a little bit of a surprise. So the first one I thought was a major surprise for me was this difference in the way that I'm using technology. When I'm in a traditional face-to-face lesson with my students, I was often using technology as a way to go deeper into the subject material, have them, do some more investigations or research. But now what I'm finding is the useful use of technology is as a way to connect with each other. So I've used tools like Flipgrid, which is a way to record video commentaries for students, and then other students can reply using their own video response. That's one way to feel like there's a community or a classroom. I also think that our Google Meet, or our decision as a school to meet virtually face to face, was really important because I think there's a much different kind of atmosphere from just setting assignments and setting tasks versus actually having some kind of connection. And a third thing that's been valuable here is this idea that we had to use students in breakout groups. So they have, for example, one of my classes is reading a novel, and we've assigned different study groups like we would in a traditional classroom. But those study groups are now working more regularly, virtually, to kind of connect. So it's not feeling like students are so isolated. I think that's really, really critical, especially now. I'm a little embarrassed to say that I hadn't really considered how important structures and routines would be in this virtual environment. Maybe it's because it's not my classroom, students are in their homes, and I sort of understood, well, maybe they're having their own routines. But actually, I think it's really, really critical that there's a certain kind of flow to each lesson. That, for example, we do some peer sharing, or we use a Jamboard as a way to sort of do some brainstorming all together in the beginning of class. There's a certain breakout session of discussion times, and then we come back together as a whole class. And as much as possible, I've tried to stick to those routines so students have a sense of what the day is going to be like. And I think that's been a shift over this week to see how that's been useful. And a very simple thing that I think has been really valuable at our school, we've used, and this is kind of silly, but we've used turn-taking techniques in our Google Chat. So we have it as a policy that all students should turn off their microphones, but if they want to say something, they have an observation or a discussion point, you can just click on an exclamation mark. It's like raising your hand. And then a question is a question mark, raising your hand. And then if we're all ready to move on, students can click in an asterisk. This seems really simple, but when there's a lot of screens or too many students in one chat, you can't always see everyone's screen. So this has been a nice way to keep track of who has the floor next. So I have a list of the students in the order, for example, that they raised their hand to create a discussion point. And this simple thing has really allowed us to have more natural discussions and without risk of each other talking over each other. Now, again, this is probably really basic stuff, but I really want to emphasize that the importance of structures and routines has been a big surprise for me. And then lastly, of course, we've talked about flipped classrooms and using time in the classroom in a different way, but I think that's even more critical now. That it's really too easy to use these kinds of presentations for the full hour and a half of our lessons and just go through note taking. But, and it sort of feels like that's probably what you should do, or at least that's how I felt when I started. I don't typically run my lessons like that in a face-to-face lesson, but I thought, well, I have to be valuable somehow, so maybe I'll just keep talking. And that will be useful for students. Plus, there's some discussion problems or lags in the computer's difficulties sometimes. But I think what's really important is that we consider how we are using home time and face-to-face screen time. And one thing that's been really interesting to me is that we get through a lot more content this way. And so I've, as the week's gone on, tried to be a little bit more generous with maybe not even using the entire hour and a half lesson time that we would in a traditional classroom. Getting up, moving around, trying to get them to do assignments that are more kinesthetic, even in an English classroom. And so that's going to be one thing I continue to think about. So by no means am I an expert in this, for sure not. But I wanted to share some of the things that have been working already in my classroom. And I also wanted to encourage other teachers to share their own resources and observations. It's been a really challenging time. As I spoke to some of our colleagues, or some of my colleagues, we sort of shared that, virtual learning is kind of twice the work and less than half of the reward. You don't really feel like you've made connections in the same kind of way with students. And it's difficult really to tell whether your presentation or your notes are making sense. It's difficult to see the light turning on, which is, for me, one of the most valuable parts of teaching, of course. And it's also, one thing I really miss is just having sort of impromptu conversations with colleagues or with students in the hall. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to continue to think about, especially if this extends in any length of time. How do we recreate those kind of impromptu or, those genuine moments? So thanks for listening. Wishing you all the best, and take care.